Good evening, participants. Welcome back to the 13th lecture of this lecture series. And this is a very important phase that we are presently in this lecture series. We have the 13th lecture today with the topic called The Literature of the Second World War and Aesthetics of Rupture, as rightly put by my co-organizer, Dr. Vasudhara, who will be joining us very soon. And today we have a very young and bright scholar, Dr. Snigdha Nagar, who completed her master's in English literature with distinction from Hyderabad Central University in 2013 and has pursued her PhD and completed on a very interesting topic. Her PhD, which she was awarded in this year, the interesting topic that I was talking about is comic at the intersection of the aesthetic and philosophic, revisiting Roald Dahl short stories. Her areas of interest include a very pertinent topic and very pertinent field, that is medical humanities, and another that is graphic narrative, dark humor, short stories, and of course children's literature. So she is basically working on very contemporary topics which we all can explore, as it has a lot of potential, be it medical humanities, graphic narrative, and of course children literature. She has presented papers in several conferences and seminars and workshops, including an international conference on medical humanities at the University of Exeter. Her publications include papers on various short stories. Of course, her writer, PhD writer also, and Sylvia Plath's poetry, and Neil Gaiman's graphic novels. She is presently an assistant professor at Behrampur College, which is under Kalyani University. Dr. Snigdha, on behalf of Team DAATH VOYAGE, and on behalf of myself and my co-organizer, Dr. Vasudhara Roy, who will be joining us soon. It's an absolute pleasure to have you today, and we are really looking forward, as I had promised my participants yesterday, for a complete cerebral treat. The platform is all yours, Dr. Snigdha.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bhattacharya, for that wonderful introduction. So, shall I begin?
Yes, please.
All right. And the topic of the lecture today is the literature of the Second World War and aesthetics of rupture. Now, I personally found this title really interesting, especially because of the use of the word rupture. A rupture means a break from something that was harmonious. And there was a break in literary landscape right after the First World War. And modernism had emerged out of the failure of humanity and all its belief systems. It highlighted post-war ugliness, spiritual squalor, and uncertainty. And with the Second World War, there was yet another break in narrative. The literary world needed to transform in order to accommodate the changing geopolitical landscape of the world. To fill this void created by the chaotic and the irrational universe exposed by World War II, there grew in literature a new strain of existential and absurdist themes. I would first like to talk about the nature of war literature in general. George Orwell said that all art is propaganda, and it is most true of writings about war. War has been the subject of poetry ever since ancient Greece, when the writer Horace writes in his odes, Dulce et decorum est pro patria more, or it is a sweet and honorable thing to die for one's country. Such patriotic sentimentality was later mocked by First World War poets like W.H. Auden, who called this an old lie told to children desperate for glory and something that creates a falsified image of war. Nevertheless, war literature, especially war poetry, originated traditionally as a form of propaganda used to glorify war as an act of patriotism and inspire the youth to enlist in the army. This was done by depicting a heroic image of war efforts and the brave soldier willing to sacrifice himself and die for the country while simultaneously obfuscating the horrors and carnage that were the ultimate reality of war. Um, Literature of war is, however, not always propaganda writing. It sometimes contains an anti-war pacifist argument of a disillusioned soldier. Despite the fact that it originated as a propaganda, war literature has over the years evolved to deal with various themes and addresses large questions like identity, innocence, guilt, loyalty, courage, compassion, humanity, duty, desire, and the ultimate questions about human mortality and death. The Second World War saw the Holocaust, the Blitz attacks, the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the magnitude of the violence, the sheer scale of it, and ensured that virtually no poet, no author was untouched by the experience of war. The Second World War gave rise to several fiction and non-fiction accounts of individuals who lived through the experience of war. While any narrative on the subject as expansive as war suffers from being too individual and myopic as compared to the magnitude of the war itself, nonetheless, each of these texts help paint a picture of war, not as propaganda or politics, but as a lived experience of human beings involved. Now, the Second World War was fought for 6 years between September 1939 and September 1945. The First World War and the Treaty of Versailles were directly responsible for this war. 20 years had passed since the First War of 1914 to 1918. The Second War was considerably different from the first in terms of political ideology, impact, motivations, and subsequently in terms of literature that emerged out of this time period. The war literature of World War I is significantly different from the war literature of World War II. In order to understand these differences, it is important to understand the fundamental differences between the two world wars. So, let us take a look at the differences between the First and the Second World Wars and the particular aspects of the Second World War that had an impact on the literary output. The Second World War met a more prepared people. Simply speaking, the world's most creative, sensitive minds, as well as those that were politically and scientifically inclined, had already known war on a scale that large and had already known what that kind of war could potentially be like because it had already happened once. The world was prepared. This accounts for the large scale increase in industry, mechanization, and weapons manufacture between the two wars. However, since, in a matter of speaking, it was nothing new, the patriotic poetry and prose that flooded British literature at the beginning of World War I was notoriously absent at the beginning of World War II. This uh, this is because all that could have been said about war was supposedly had already been said. Furthermore, there were considerably fewer trench poets and trench poetry. This was because fighting was no longer confined to the trenches like it was during World War I. It had taken to the skies. So fighting was more done by bombs and fighter planes, etc. Another significant way in which the Second World War was different from the first was the lack of patriotic strain in poetry. Unlike the First World War, where the soldiers were called to fight for their country. In the Second World War, the narrative was slightly different. The narrative was that this was a fight between good and evil, between the defenders of democracy and justice on one side, the allied forces of Britain, America, Russia, and the evil, oppressive forces of communism and militarism, Hitler, Nazi Germany, Japan, on the other side. The narrative was a very flimsy construct, and as war narratives generally are, it was created by the victors. And upon a closer consideration, you'll see that it ravels quite easily. The champions of democracy, the Allied forces, included a Stalin-led Russia, which, as we know, was one of the least democratic leaders in the history of the world. Secondly, even in the battlefield, the soldiers who belonged to ethnic and racial minorities, especially African Americans, were ultimately aware of the irony that they were fighting for a country that had systematically oppressed them for years. Moreover, the British imperialists were wholly dependent on the colonies for support, manpower, and production. Not only that, but they also systematically caused mass food shortages and starvation in the colonies by reallocating food rations to feed their troops. When this led to man made famines, Britain refused to provide aid and redirect supplies to, to the said colonies, as it would have diverted necessary resources that they were using for the war. A famous example of this is, of course, the Bengal famine of 1943, where around 3 million people died of starvation. Thus, the bottom line is the war can never be simplified into moralistic platitudes of good or evil. World War II encourages one to have a more complex image of the world, have a more complex idea of morality, which led to obviously a much more complex, deep, and philosophical literary output, as this lecture attempts to analyze. Lastly, all wars cost innocent lives, but one stark difference between the First and the Second World War was that the majority of casualty of the First World War was soldiers, whereas in the Second World War, because of massive air raids upon cities, Holocaust, and atomic bombs, the large scale war induced famines, etc., 90% of the casualty were civilians. These were innocent people who had nothing to do with the war, had not signed up for the violence, but they were subjected to it nonetheless. As a result of this, grudging the war and the impact that it had was no longer an act that went against patriotic sentiments. It was considered a general response to the ongoing conflict. I would now like to share with you a Second World War painting. Now, the given painting is called Totes Meer, or the Dead Sea, by Paul Nash. He was a German painter, and this painting was done around the time of the Second World War, and it highlights the mechanized nature of the World War II. You see here, this Dead Sea is basically crashed airplanes, and in the distance, you probably can see very, very far away, there is a flying bird, which is an owl, uh, right above the horizon. Now, the war efforts were Second World war efforts were more dependent on fighter pilots, atom bombs, tanks, etc. This had a defamiliarizing effect on the landscape of World War II. It was this that played to the artist's imagination in works like Totes Meer or The Dead Sea by Paul Nash. The German artist produced the aforementioned work in 1941, and it was inspired by a wreckage that he saw in Cowley, Oxfordshire, England. There lived, and I quote, there lived in death innumerable vehicles of destruction of different personality, once all directed by human agency, some in character of ships manned by crews, others clearly bound up with man as a horse to its rider. There was a persistent suggestion of a ghostly presence, nothing decidedly human, but a pervasive force, baffled yet malign, hung in the heavy air. End quote. This painting highlights two very important aspects of the war and the literary output of the war. Uh, Firstly, the war was highly automated and mechanized, and men's weapons of destruction were vast, unrelenting, and as chaotic and as the forces of nature itself. Secondly, as you can see, the owl that's very, very tiny in the picture, uh, it's easily missed and it blends into the background almost. The contrast between the graveyard of airplanes and the tiny bird flying overhead is an example of how nature's own flying predators look small in comparison to man's potential for destruction and cruelty. For these reasons, the literature that came out of the Second World War had a different tone, mood, theme than that which came out of the First World War and even the years prior to it. It reflected the overwhelming fragmentation and confusion of the time it as it is an oeuvre of work that cannot easily be boxed together or categorized. The aesthetics of these writings is not uniform and cannot be generalized because it is an aesthetic, as the lecture says, of rupture. It was a rupture in the fabric of humanity and the fabric of human experiences. Having explored the ethos of the time and the background of the literary output, now let's take a closer look at the said literary output of the time. So these were a few propaganda posters during the Second World War. As you can see, uh, this is the British flag and this is the Soviet flag side by side. And it says together, there is this African American man and this man in a turban. Uh, there was undertone of racial harmony. Okay, so the very early years of the war saw the rise of apocalyptic poets. These broke away from the earlier traditions and focused instead on surrealism, using David Gascoigne's short survey of surrealism as their inspiration. The poets of the apocalypse used nightmarish images veered towards surrealism in an age of machines and mechanization. With the threat of the mechanized war just around the corner, these poets wrote from a nihilistic political overview. The movement soon lost momentum due to varied factors, not the least of which was the rationing of paper during the war years. Paper was heavily rationed by the Ministry of Supplies, and as such, only few poems or short stories could be produced. These poets were later subsumed under a larger category of neo romantic poets who aimed to be a revival of the romantic ideals. These poets continued on the same strand of surrealism while reverting back to the roots of romantic poetry. This era saw a revival of romantic poetry in many parts of the world. The Second World War encouraged a number of poets to return to nature for their subject matter and for their sanity. Among these was Dylan Thomas, who was a pacifist and a representative head of the neo-romantic movement. The central so the central idea that Dylan Thomas puts forward is a move away from the mechanized and the automated and towards the personal and the individual through a focus in mythology. So let's look at Dylan Thomas. So Dylan Thomas was one of the first neo-romantic, was the lead of the neo-romantic poets. He was a pacifist and he was a pacifist born in 27th October 1914 and he died in 9th November 1953. He was a Welsh poet known for such poems as "Do not go gentle into that good night," and "Death shall have no dominion," and he was also a radio broadcaster for several um, radio networks, and it gained him much popularity throughout his life. Dylan Thomas's poetry protested the pervasive mechanization of war through an organic rhythm in the poem. Despite being neo-romantic, Dylan's poetry does not always consist of the natural and environmental imagery. Uh, mm, Sorry, yeah, um, environmental imagery. However, in the wake of the Blitz, the atom bomb, his poetry speaks more of the natural world as well as his own Welsh childhood. Most of the early warriors, Dylan Thomas spent his energy actively avoiding the war, killing, actively avoiding the war, actively avoiding going to the front lines, killing or getting killed. It was no secret, and he told this very openly, that his determination to avoid the war was a blend of pacifism, anti war stance, and cowardly self centeredness. His poems are not personal and sentimental because he refuses to poeticize or glorify any aspect of war. But one of his better known poems, the one that you see the quote from here, was Refusal to Mourn the Dead by Fire of a Child in London. This poem was written in 1945 and published in 1946. It was inspired by the sight of this anonymous little girl who was burnt to death due to airstrikes in London. Thomas bemoans the loss of innocent life, even as he ironically refuses to do so. Angered by the propaganda that war generates, and it offers up the girl almost as a sacrifice to war, Thomas prefers to remain silent and offers instead a hymn to the departed. The poem begins and ends with contradiction, never until and first death. That seems to reflect his own thoughts on the girl's death. It sets up a contrast between the finite world of the war and death and the infinite world of nature to which he wishes to return. And I quote, Deep with the first dies lies London's daughter, dropped in the long trends, the grains beyond age, the dark veins of a mother, secret by the unmourning water of the riding Thames. After the first death, there is no other. The poem feels like a shell shocked response to the violence of war. It is also extremely ambiguous in terms of the central message that it carries. Thomas reflects on the nature of life and death and contemplates on what happens after death. The last line, after the first death, there is no other, could mean either after death, there is nothing, no more dying, there will be no more death, which means there will be heaven and eternal bliss. It could also mean that after death, there is absolutely nothing else, nothing at all. There was yet another branch of poetry that was being written in England, and this was by the Oxford School of Poets. These were an emerging group of academic writers who were leaving their alma mater in time of war to enlist in the army. The poetry produced by them have the same surrealist, neo-romantic strain, but these poems also have an element of Christian faith. While the poetry of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien successfully articulates the dark wartime melancholia, nowhere is the despair of war more palpable than in the work of Sidney Keith. I quote, How 10 men fell by one heroic sword, and of fierce foray by the unwatched ford, sing blinded faith. Quick hands in darkness groping, pluck the sad heart forever hooping. Valhalla may be songless, enter the moment of your glory, out of clamor, molding your vision to such harmony that drunken heroes cannot choose but honor your stubborn, blinded pride, your inward winter. The given excerpt is from the poem The Bard and appears in a collection called The Cruel Solstice, published in 1944. Here, he imitates the old poets of ancient Greece who wrote with divine inspiration, but in war, unfortunately, both music and the instrument are bathed with melancholia, as Keats highlights the brutalizing effects of war's violence. His poem, Gile de Retz, highlights the violence of war, while the poem quoted here, The Foreign Gate, highlights the suffering of Jews across Europe. And I quote, pain is never personal, as love or anger unconfined. It takes part in each moment and person, unconditioned by time or identity, like an atmosphere. There is no giving or receiving, only pain and creation coming out of pain. Another prominent soldier poet who dealt with the subject of war after having first-hand experience with it was Keith Douglas, who he was a tank commander in the British Army stationed in North Africa. His poems are honest and lack the sentimentality and that comes with a war poet, usually describing the horrors of war. In fact, his initial reaction to war was that it was nothing new and therefore nothing new could be said about it. Keith Douglas says in an essay titled Poets in This War, quote, hell cannot be let loose twice. It was let loose in the Great War, and it is the same old hell now. The detached nature of his poetry and the objectivity with which he is able to relate it is clearly seen in most of the wartime is most clearly seen in the wartime poet How to Kill. It reflects a chilling cold hardness that he feels when he recounts his own experience with personal combat, and as he realizes how easy it was to kill a man, and he wrote a poem about that. And I quote, the wires touch his face, I cry now. Death, like a familiar, hears, and look, has made a man of dust of a man of flesh. This sorcery I do, being damned. I am amused to see the center of love diffused and the wave of love travel into vacancy. How easy it is to make a ghost. This is an extremely chilling reflection on the realization that life and death are so very close to each other. Some other noteworthy mentions of poets in England include Alan Lewis, uh, whose poem Ha Ha Among the Trumpets was published posthumously because he died in war. Uh, Charles Chauceley, who wrote 270 poems with 50 directly related to his wartime experience. All of these are soldier poets of the Second World War. Alan Ross, who's better known for describing the battle as it took place in the sea because he was a naval soldier. Keith Barnes published three collections of poems, Born to Flying Glass, The Thick Skin, and Isn't Hung Yet. Gavin Ewart wrote anti-heroic sort of poetry about everyday lives of the soldiers. It wasn't about fighting or life and death. It was mostly about boredom of the everyday and the absurdity of the soldier's life in the battlefield. Then there was Henry Reed, who never actually saw active combat but wrote poems that anthologized uh, that have been widely anthologized in war poetry sections. This naming of part, the poem mentioned here, is a mockery of a drill sergeant during a training exercise. With this, we come to prose, short stories. Due to rationing of paper, the short story was an ideal medium that provided a quick literary response to an ever-changing condition of war. Short stories characterize brevity and focus on a singular subject matter. As such, they were ideal modes for expressing the fragmentation, anxiety, and the unpredictability of the time. Noteworthy names of short story writers include Alan Lewis, who in his collected stories refers to the status of the army recruit as very low in the ranks. And then there is Sir Angus Frank Johnstone Wilson, who who received sorry, who sorry, who served the Navy as a code breaker and published several collection of short stories. Angus Wilson's most notable wartime work is uh, a novel called No Laughing Matter, which is an autobiographical novel containing the panoramic image of the time between 1912 and 1967. And Henry Green also wrote a collection of short stories highlighting the new conditions under which he found England. His Surviving the Collected Writings of Henry Green found critical acclaim during his time. Now, we will take a more detailed look at two short story writers. One is Roald Dahl. Roald Dahl was an RAF pilot who served the Royal Air Force during the Second World War. He took up short story writing as it was a very lucrative way of documenting the war experience, and he produced several short stories about the reality of war. The most notable include the ones mentioned here: A Piece of Cake, The Gremlins, The Sword, Katina, Only This, Beware of Dog, They Shall Not Grow Old, Death of an Old Man, and Over to You. The short story Katina exemplifies and supposes the awful fatalism of war. Katina is a little girl that the squadron has rescued from a bombing site, and later she joins ranks with the squadron and stays with them. At 9 years of age, she has witnessed the death of her entire family. Unlike the other soldiers who have a more mature understanding of war, Katina reimagines the German soldiers as a, to have some sort of a monstrous visage. So much so that on her first encounter with a German soldier, she is confounded. She says, and I quote, "There must be a mistake. This one has pink cheeks and fair hair and blue eyes. This cannot possibly be one of them. This is an ordinary boy." So the realization, of course, is that in war, the villains are just human beings. Dahl's stories often explore the inherent trauma the experience of war causes. Many of the stories are not so much about the experience of war or living through the war, or rather, it is reliving it inside one's psyche. Dahl's story, Death of an Old Man, uh, is in his collection of short stories called Over to You, and it provides a similarly realistic account of the life of a fighter pilot. The story deals with the last mission of an exceptionally gifted fighter pilot called Charlie. The story comments on themes like the fear of death, mechanization, desensitization of the soldier in the line of fire, and peace that comes with the final acceptance of the inevitable. Most importantly, Dahl comments on human predilection to hope and survival, even in the face of the most horrifying truths. Underlying the mechanical response of the pilot when he is being commissioned for his final mission and the equally mechanical maneuvers that he deploys when he is under attack by the German pilot lies a commentary on the deep horror of war. The true horror is evident from the apparent calmness behind a terrified man, lies in how soon war successfully dehumanizes and desensitizes an individual. The short story, within its limited canvas, shifts from the first person narrative through a third person narrative and then back again. The reader is made to see the war both from the eyes of the dying soldier and from outside it. The story takes a huge pride in helping the reader take a distant, subjective view of death. The soldier's consciousness rises from his own limp body, and with the awareness that he's dead, he wishes to do nothing more than spread the message of peace. Quote, I was a fool to have struggled so long, for so much for so long. I was a fool to have prayed for sun when there was a black cloud in the sky. Much like Death of an Old Man, someone like you narrates the tale of a fighter pilot rendered old not by age, but through his experience in war. Unlike the former story, the war here does not ultimately result in serene peace of mind and soul. Rather, it isolates the individual from society at large. Being a young, so quote, from being a young bouncing boy, he had become someone old, wise, and gentle. He had become gentle like a wounded child. He had become old like a tired man of 70 years. The the other significant name that worth taking a closer look at is William Somerset S.M. Maugham. Uh, he was the first World War veteran who lived through most of his 60s in America. In the early years of war, before America's involvement, Maugham was asked to give rousing patriotic speeches to the American public to encourage them amid to join to encourage them to aid England in the war. The most significant contribution that he made to World War literature was in the form of a short story called The Conquered, written in 1943, set in a Nazi occupied France. The story deals with two German soldiers who rape and impregnate the wife of a local farmer. On discovering that the wife of the farmer was pregnant, the soldier, whose name is Hans, decides to marry her and take over the farm. He has realized that he is in love with her and he will marry her. And this woman, whose name is Annette, she protests, and her protests are met with her husband, are met with her husband's absolute helplessness and just surrender. And he says, and I quote, "We've been defeated and must accept the consequences. We've got to make the best arrangements we can with the conquerors." Annette still wishes to hurt the man who she hates as the conqueror and the perpetrator of the violence. So, uh, eventually, what she does is that she murders her own child, and the short story ends with Hans screaming in agony because of the murder that has happened. And this short story makes you aware of it raises a poignant awareness of the fact that when violence is used to combat violence, it leaves no winners, only the wounded. Hans screams wildly. It was a cry of the mortally wounded beast. He closed his eyes with his hands, staggering like a drunk, rushed out of the house. Annette collapsed into the chair, head down on clenched fist, sobbed passionately, passionately. End quote. Despite the obvious convenience of short stories as a medium, the period did see a considerable number of novel writers as well. James Henley, his novel No Direction captures the shock and disorientation of the Blitz. The story narrates the experience of a drunken soldier who steps on broken glass and suddenly thinks that he is on top of pack ice that is about to break up. He finds himself on uh, grounding that he thinks ground that he thinks will break and swallow him. The central idea of the novel is that from London Blitz attack, as planes and tanks bombarded the scene, it created a kind of sensory overload, so much so that the actual experience could not be narrativized in conventional terms. So, World War II novel, The Ocean and The Sailor's Song, both are quite similar. They deal with his maritime heroism during the war, and it's tales of ships that have been torpedoed and sunk at the sea, and the subsequent response of the crew and how they deal with it. Uh, the other three novels are his post-war novels, Emily, The Closed Harbor, and Levine. And the war is also a very significant part to play in these novels. Henry Green served as a firefighter in the auxiliary fire services during the Second World War. His novel Caught puts forth an almost autobiographical account of his experience in the war years. Much like the literary writing of the time, Green's work looks at the war in part through the innocence of a child. The way children understood war and how it molded them was a popular theme of much literature of the time. Green contrasts the bleak reality of the war with the childish, childish fascination with it. This childish fascination, it is this fascination due to which the war appealed to the imagination of children, and this is highlighted through the character of Christopher, who is the son of the protagonist. It is also revealed through the second child in the novel, who is the stray boy, who is the author finds out later, just runs out into the streets at night to see if the planes have come and the bombs are being dropped again. Quote, so mad so mad to see a raid that he often stepped out at night in case there was one at last. End quote. In the final section of the novel, Christopher plays a game that is centered around the war, and um, it's as he rushes around the garden and he starts destroying each and every bush in the yard. He says, "Look," Christopher says, with another snowball in his hand. "I'm a German airman and I'm bombing." This leads to a chilling conversation between the father and the son. "Look," his father interrupted, "haven't you knocked those branches about enough? There's hardly a bird left in the garden since you've been out. You'd do better to put food for them. They starve in this weather, you know." "They're Polish people," Christopher said, "and I'm a German policeman. I'm rootling them out." This exchange is perhaps the most disturbing portrayal of how popular belief influences the impressionable young mind. Other significant works of this period include Patrick Hamilton, Hangover Square, Graham Greene's Ministry of Fear, Gypsy Gypsy by Ruben Gordon, I Am Lazarus, Asylum Peace by Anna Kavan. Other writers by Evelyn Waugh also wrote Brideshead Revisited, and Virginia Woolf wrote Between the Acts. These writers did not write directly about the war. In fact, they tried to keep the focus away from it and focus instead on the pastoral memory of England's glorious past. Uh, we move on to American poetry and prose, and these were the propaganda posters that were circulating around the time. Once again, the idea of winning to and the left show multiracial people fighting together because racism was a very big issue, and they feared that this would be something that would affect the morale of the troops. And the poster in the middle is about how rations were reallocated around the war, and interestingly, a fact about the war is that the German army, in the American army, the soldiers were the most well-fed of all the troops that were fighting. Um, the country that had the soldiers that were the least well-fed were the Japanese, but these people had a fair bit of rations, and that's because the country reallocated a lot of rations to their men. Uh, so uh, a brief introduction. Harvey Shapiro wrote an anthology called Poets of World War II, where he wrote, quote, "Common wisdom has it that poets of World War I, Wilfred Owen, Robert Graves, Siegfried Sassoon, Edmund Blunden, Isaac Rosenberg left us a monument, and the poets of World War II did not." In support of this argument, Paul Fussell suggests two reasons why World War II produced less poetry than World War One. Firstly, the sheer magnitude of brutality one witnessed in World War II rendered the poets silent. Faced with faced with events so unprecedented, so inaccessible to normal models of human understanding, literature spent a lot of time standing silent and aghast. The themes that generally form the core of war poetry, like patriotism, valor, heroism, had been sufficiently exhausted by World War One. And Peter Fussell writes, what is there to say except what has been said the first time? Despite this, America witnessed many war poets. However, for reasons already stated, war poetry was more diverse structurally and thematically than those seen before. The lack of cohesion in the poetic works of the period are an accurate reflection of the fragmented historical and ethical configuration of the war. The US entered the war late, and when it did, it was with high flown ideas of combating European totalitarianism and Japanese militarism. World War II was popularized as the good war. As such, it became exceedingly difficult to endorse a pacifist anti war stance in its literature. Some of the most prominent poetic figures of the period, like Louis Simpson, Richard Hugo, Randall Gerard, wrote poems from an inexperienced standpoint, from a worldview of those who were still unaccustomed to the reality of war's true horrors. And a contrast to them are poems of Harvey Shapiro, Howard Nemerov, and Gwendolyn Brooke, who wrote about war from first hand experience. Lastly, there were poets that wrote canonical poetry like W.H. Auden and spoke firsthand of, once again, of the realism of war. The first poet we're looking at, obviously, is Louis Simpson, born in 27th March 1923, died in 18 September 2012. He was born in Jamaica, and his poem Carlton O Carlton talks about the World War II experience as it begins in an idyllic pastoral setting, and suddenly the setting is changes with the entry of soldiers and guns. The poem reflects an almost childlike wonderment at the sight of combat as the speaker compares the war to a children's game where injuries are not serious. Everything is all right, mother. It's all a game. The confusion that the speaker feels when the captain is supposed to give orders, is actually silent, is also depicted with an uncomprehending innocence usually associated with childhood. Quote, but the captain's sickly and taking a long nap. Now, his Richard Hugo's poetry is really interesting if you see it. The structurally, it looks quite interesting, and I will discuss that right now. He was in the Army Air Corps, and he was a bombardier. So he was responsible for dropping the bombs. And his poem Where We Crashed is inspired by the crash landing of a B 24 in which Hugo flew. So the poem is stylistically a little avant-garde, and this is because visually, if you can see it, it depicts the urgency and the impending danger and the vertical descent of the dropping of a bomb. The poem seems to originate from the psyche of one who is immediately, like, who is completely unable to speak in full sentences because of the immediacy of danger, and resorts instead to short bursts of phrases and words to express themselves. The poem produces a very visceral and a very real sense of danger and endangerment and violence. Naff, Bolcheret, joking, farmer, yelling, Steinberg, staring grey, and in the grass, I didn't die. Um, the next person we are going to look at is Randall Jerez. Uh, Before I go into who the poet was, if you look at this, this is called a ball turret. It is a small circular box where the bomber or the gunner was kept. And it was so small and claustrophobic, only smaller men could fit into that. And this poem is about what happens rather, when one of them dies. Um, so Gerald served in the Air Force and manned a ball turret. That was his job. In this poem, he talks about institutionalized violence and the moral paradox that the war creates. The poem explains what a ball turret is. As you can see from the picture, it is a confined space where the bomber is supposed to sit. So the poem talks about the experience that of the bomber that is sitting in that confined little space while the ball is twisting and turning. So Gerald compares this to a child inside the fetus of a mother, and he is transformed from a human being to a helpless animal who is freezing. Uh, yeah, I hunched in its belly till my wet fur froze. Um, Trapped in a lair, the bomber is off. So if the bomber dies, what happens is that they have to clean it out with a hose. There, it's so small that it's very difficult to actually evacuate the dead body from the confines of the ball turret. So they have to clean out the remains on the dead body with a hose after he dies. So this actually, since the person inside is being compared to a fetus inside a mother's womb, this act of cleaning out the hole is being compared to a forceful, violent abortion. The jarring image of the stillborn child underlines the stunned mental and physical growth that is the result of trauma and premature death that is the result of war. Harvey Shapiro. Shapiro's war stories begin with the innocence of childhood and sees the speaker through the adolescence and adulthood, and is deferred by the onset, which is deferred by the onset of war. The speaker is deployed to fight the enemy. He looks at the scenes of bombing firsthand, but it does not seem real to him somehow. Quote, how to believe all that happened as in a movie or a TV drama or some other life. This creates a sense of defamiliarization between the soldier and the actual experience of war. Howard Nero wrote an entire volume of poetry called War Stories. His poems aim to deflate the idea that what America was fighting was the good war, and he questions the ethical goodness of any event that can result in such massive violence and death. It was a good war, the war we won, as if there were no death, for goodness sake. And this is a quote from his poem, The War in Air. The poem was also an attempt to devalue the myth of heroism and military prowess of the American army, as well as the popular notion that the Allied forces won the war because they occupied a moral high ground. His poem, IFF, Identification Friend of Foe, underlines the fact that evil resided on both sides. Not to forget my navigator Bert, who shyly explained to me that the Jews were ruining England and Hitler might be wrong, but he had the right idea. Anti Semitism was a popular sentiment even among the Allied forces, and this made it difficult for the American Jewish soldiers to completely buy into the narrative of the moral high ground. Uh, Another poet, before I come to Auden, another poet that highlights the irony of the moral high ground is Gwendolyn Brooks, who talks about the African American soldiers fighting for democratic ideals in a country that ultimately had been oppressing them and denying them their rights for several years. And then W.H. Auden, who was born in England, he was not an American by birth, but the reason why he's here is because in the war years, 1939 and to 1945, these years he spent in America and he was granted American citizenship in 1945. Auden wrote a poem called September 1st, 1939. In this poem, he talks about the beginning of the war as he senses the unmentionable odor of death. His vision of war is one that is begun by a larger than life entity, a psychotic god, which is Hitler. Auden also went on to write Refugee Blues, where he imagines the plight of the German Jews who were left homeless and hunted down and persecuted by their own country. The poem underlines the fact that their condition was worse than that of stray animals. Quote, saw a poodle in a jacket fastened with a pin, saw a door open and a cat let in. But they weren't German Jews, my dear. They weren't German Jews. Other significant poets of World War II in America include Robert Lowell and Marianne Moore. Uh, There was also a significant production of novels that dealt with the experience of war. Most notable among them was Irwin Shaw. Irwin Shaw's novel, The Young Lions, entails one of the earliest accounts of war. It centers around the lives of three soldiers. One is an Austrian, and there are two Americans. The most remarkable character study is the Austrian soldier, because he's a Nazi, and we come to see him from before he is a Nazi to when he becomes a Nazi. So his name is Christian Dristel. Dristel starts out as a very sympathetic character who is drawn to Nazi ideology out of a deep concern for the future. As the novel progresses, he becomes less and less sympathetic as the reader realizes that he is growing increasingly cruel and shows a willingness to sacrifice Jews for his own survival. This German soldier was used to show how, in Shaw's own words, quote, how a man can start out as decent, intelligent, well meaning, as so many people in Germany must have been, even in the greatest days of Nazism, and wind up bestialized, almost bereft of humanity, almost dead to the instincts of survival, even as the Germans finally were, by believing in one false thing that spreads and spreads and finally corrupts them entirely. And this false thing, of course, is not something that he mentions, but it is very obviously racial prejudice and hatred. The novel is adapted into a well received and critically acclaimed movie by the same name. Yet another noteworthy author is Herman Wouk, who wrote The Caine Mutiny. Wouk uses his own experiences as a US naval reserve to write about the central protagonist, Willis Seward Key, and the misadventures of this central character on board a destroyer on the minesweeper USS King. He went on to write two more, historical novels about World War One, Winds of War, 1917, and War of Remembrance, 1978. One Another novelist that was hailed as one of the best writers of World War II fiction is Norman Mailer and his Naked and the Dead. Norman considers his brief stint in the US Navy as a cook the worst experience of his life. So he didn't even experience combat firsthand, but it is basically for him one of the worst experiences that he's ever lived through. This story, The Naked and the Dead, revolves around 13 American soldiers, and it looks at their lives, each and every individual lives, through flashbacks and backstories, and highlights themes such as anxiety and loneliness, not to mention the dehumanization of soldiers during war, and how they have to constantly fight that anxiety that death is around the corner. Now, not all accounts of war were very serious. Um some deeply disturbing portrayal of war carries the tone of levity and humor. Joseph Heller's Catch 22 is an excellent example of the darkly comic vision of war. The anti hero of the novel is Captain John Rosarian of the US Air Force. Uh, Catch 22 is basically a situation from which there is no winning. In very simple words, the Catch 22 basically was, if you did not want to fight the war, obviously it makes you sane. You don't want to die, so you have sanity. Only sane people don't want to die. But the only way you could get out of fighting would be to have yourself certified as insane. But if you went to certify yourself as insane, it would prove that you're sane because you're trying to get out of a war. So that this is explained by the quote here. There was only one catch, and that was Catch 22, or would be crazy to fly more missions, and sane if he didn't. But if he was sane, he had to fly them. If he flew them, he was crazy and he didn't have to. If he didn't want to, he was sane and he had to. And that is Catch 22. Yozarian confronts the brutal nature of war, and which includes incidents involving death, murder, rape, complete psychological breakdowns. The novel can be taken to be a study of a soldier's psyche who is said by some to be the only sane one left, while others believe that he is insane because he has, quote, a morbid aversion to dying. Now, another very interesting novel that can be read alongside Heller as a less than serious portrayal of war is Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five. Now, the novel can be said to to be existential in language as it uses language to explain war and the subsequent events. It deals with the war veteran Billy Pilgrim, who has become unstuck in time after his alien abduction, and now he experiences all time simultaneously. Underlying the surface contemplations on Billy Pilgrim's questionable sanity is a deeply philosophical reflection on the ontological questions of life and death. Billy, because of his unique gift of being unstuck in time, is able to see death as from an objective standpoint, as a merely a fact rather than a major event. The existentialist theme is underlined by the refrain of the novel, "So it goes," which helps highlight the emptiness of language to fully capture the essence of loss on a large scale. The novel is also a reflection on the absurdity of the human condition, as illustrated from these quotes. The first is about his attitude towards death. The most important thing I learned on Trafalgar. So this was the planet where he was captured to. These were the people who had captured him, the aliens. Was that when a person dies, he only appears to die. Now, when I myself hear that somebody is dead, I simply shrug and say that the Tralfamadorians say about death, dead people, which is so it goes. The question of absurdity is when he is asking them why he was the one who was abducted by aliens and not someone else. He says, "Why me?" And they reply, "This is a very earthling question to ask, Mr. Pilgrim. Why you? Why us for that matter? Why anything? Because this moment simply is. Have you ever seen bugs trapped in amber? Yes. Well, here we are, Mr. Pilgrim, trapped in the amber of this moment. There is no why." So the idea is the human condition is inherently, intrinsically absurd. Another author worthy of a more detailed look is James Jones. His bestseller, From Here to Eternity, tells the story of the life at Schofield Barracks near Honolulu in the months before Pearl Harbor. There are several interesting characters in the novel, but it has often been argued that the central protagonist of the novel is the quote unquote system that governs the actions of the characters and leaves one feeling suffocated. And I quote, "Feeling you're locked up in a box that's two sizes too small for you, and there's no air in it, and you're suffocating, and all the time outside the box, you can hear the whole world walking around and laughing and having a big, big time." The lines of the novel clearly capture claustrophobia of a group trapped in a situation from which there is no escape. Yet another one of James's novels, The Thin Red Line, fully develops the complex relationship that comes to exist during the war between an individual and an organization which he serves. Buck Sergeant Big Queen is a character that is injured, and towards the end of the novel, he is discharged and he's about to go home because of his injuries. Instead, he ends up escaping from the hospital so that he may rejoin the war and possibly die, because he feels that it is in the battlefield among his comrades from the C for Charlie company that his place is and that he truly belongs. Jones's novel does not romanticize the war. The reason he's going back is not because war is depicted in a very beautiful way. It's and this is clearly seen from a passage in the novel that depicts the charred bodies of dead Japanese soldiers. His head was crushed from ear to his jaw, and it lay sodden on the running board of the vehicle as if it were a beanbag. Another Japanese lay on his back a short distance away. He had a great hole in his intestines that bunched out in thick white cluster like congested petals of sea flower, and singed cloth from his uniform that rotted away and exposed his scorched genitals. They had burned down to tiny stumps, but ash of his pubic hair still remained like tight clump of steel wool. The interesting thing about this is how he is constantly comparing the horrors seen in the war, for example, the intestine spewing out with thick white clusters of congested flowers, the singed cloth and the scorched genitals as clump of steel wool used to clean utensils. So the comparison is between what one never sees and hopes to never see during the war and everyday household items. So he is kind of trying to familiarize the war by comparing the extraordinary to the everyday and ordinary. Uh, so a few more works worth mentioning are Thomas Pinion's Gravity's Rainbow, and which is existential reflection on the meaningless of war and the plight of the common citizen. And after this, to expand the understanding of the war, we are going to look at world literature. So we have propaganda posters here once again. From the left, we have one from Japan, one from Germany, one from Italy, and the last one is, uh, I think, no, the second last is from France, and then there's one from Italy. We'll start with Japan. Like stated before, the narrative of World War II stands the risk of becoming a narrative of the victors. To combat this, it is necessary to take a look at literature from the rest of the world. Many countries produced copious amounts of literary text pertaining to the events of the war. A more detailed look at the other parts of the world would help create a more complete picture of the complex moral tapestry of war. So, the Japanese short story Hataru no Haka, or The Grave of Fireflies, is a 1964 semi autobiographical short story by Japanese author I, uh, Akiyuki Nosaka. It is a beautifully told story that is turned into an animated movie and recounts the tale of a little boy and his sister in a war torn Japan. During the war, Nosaka herself suffered several personal losses. His sister died of an illness, his father was killed in a firebombing incident, and his adopted sister died of malnutrition. So it is about the adoptive sister that this story is about, and the story is a personal letter of apology to Kyoko, his adoptive sister, and it is a poignant tale of a double suicide and of a childhood that was cut too short. Japanese authors have a plethora of World War II writing that relates specifically to the incident of the atomic bomb. Himeki Hara and her semi-autobiographical short story, Natsu no Hana, or Summer Flowers, narrates his experience in 1945 as he was exposed to the atomic bomb. The story is based on notes that he made on the 7th August, the day right after the bombing of Hiroshima, where the author was at the time. Another remarkable work that speaks of the experience of bombing is by Kyoko Hayashi, and the work is called Akikan, or The Empty Can. Hayashi was in Nagasaki when the bomb went off and was seriously ill for several months. When she recovered, she began to write about her experience, and this led to uh, This led to several notable works. The aforementioned work, The Empty Can, is a retrospective look on the atomic bomb and its impact. It is a tale of five women who travel back in 1970s to their high school, which was formerly bombed, and they look around and they start to relive the unforgettable memories of the day when the bomb was dropped. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, uh, Kenza, sorry, Kenzaburo Oe uh, was perhaps the most famous among the list of Japanese authors who wrote about the experiences of the Second World War. Oe won the Nobel Prize in Literature for his contribution, as well as for writing about the indirect experiences of war, often from the point of view of children. Examples of these are Shiku or Catch, which was later made into a film, and Nip the Butts Shoot the Kids, which is the experience of war as seen from the point of view of an adolescent boy in a plague stricken village of Japan. Oi also wrote uh, Hiroshima Notes 1965, which are a collection of essays that underlines the fact that Hiroshima is not over, nor can it be said to be over while the survivors of the blast continue to suffer to the very day. At his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, Oy stated he's writing about the dignity of human beings, and that is indeed what is evident from his work. In Italy, Mussolini had come to power in 1922, and since then he had militarized the Italian youth. And after taking inspiration from Hitler, the entire country was under a totalitarian regime. As such, there were two different kinds of writings that came out of Italy that pertained to the war experience. The first was war itself and the experience of combat. So for example, Rigoni Stern in 1953 memoir, Sergeant in the Snow, talks about war from the perspective of the memory of an ordinary soldier and his devastating experience. It details Stern's own travels across Europe, but the most remarkable part entails the description of the army suffering from physical and mental exhaustion while trying to stay alive in Russia at minus 30 degrees of winter cold. Yet another vibrant yet jarring account of the war is provided by Curzio Malaparte in Caput and Skin. uh, Malaparte was a fascist who later converted to a communist, and the novel Kaput was written secretly during the time that he was in the army and they traveled across Europe. He wrote about all his wartime experiences, including the mass murder of Jews that he witnessed firsthand. He mentions in his novel the day when he knew that war had taken a turn. He was in Ukraine. I'm so sorry. He was in Ukraine and he saw the defeat on the faces of the German soldiers. And he quotes and he writes, "When Germans become afraid, when that mysterious German fear begins to creep into their bones, they always arouse a special horror and pity. Their appearance is miserable, their cruelty is sad, their courage silent and hopeless." But then he knew the winning war was over. The losing war had begun. Um, I'm so sorry. I saw the white strain of fear growing in their dull eyes. So this was the entire quote. And the novel details the experience of war from the side that is doomed to failure and defeat. Yet another branch of literary output is centered around the experience of Holocaust. Many Italian writers were fortunate enough, sorry, were unfortunate enough to experience the horrors of the Holocaust firsthand, and a few lived to document this nightmare. One significant among these is the one whose picture is there on the PPT. His name is Primo Levi, who was a Jewish chemist and a writer whose accounts of the Holocaust shed a light on the systematic destruction of human identity of the Jews by the Nazis. The memoir that he writes is called If This Is a Man, and in it he details the experience of the prisoner in Auschwitz concentration camp from the day of his capture to the day when he was finally released. His memoir is a hauntingly beautiful retelling of this dehumanization as the prisoners are robbed of name, identity, and autonomy. And I quote, "Consider if this is a man who works in the mud, who fights for a scrap of bread, who dies because of a yes or a no. Consider if this is a woman without hair and without name, with no more strength to remember, her eyes empty and her womb cold like a frog in winter." Yet another Holocaust survivor as the Italian journalist Liana Milou, who also wrote uh, about it in her autobiography, Smoke Over Birkenau. Birkenau was another part of Auschwitz, and the memoir consists of six different stories about six different women who were with Milau mm, in the camp. The tale is not about the capture. I'm so sorry. The tale is not so much about the capture and internment as it is about the daily lives and the labors that they were forced to do. The foreword of the book is written by Primo Levi, and in it he highlights that the condition of women in the concentration camp were far worse than the condition of men. Firstly, they were made to do more degrading physical labor, the ones that were not suitable for men. Secondly, they were made to work around the furnaces where they would ultimately be burned, so that image of the furnace would always be there. And thirdly, because they were weak inherently, the continuous exhaustion for them would be even more harrowing. And from the forward, I'll read out a quote. Let less physical endurance coupled with more arduous work, degrading than the labor imposed upon the men and agonies of disrupted families. Above all, the haunting presence of the crematoria, located right in the middle of the women's camp, inescapable, undeniable, their ungodly smoke rising from the chimneys to contaminate every day, every night, every moment of respite or illusion, every dream of timorous hope. Um, So France was another very interesting literary landscape. For France, the war was experienced as for a considerably shorter time, but that did not take away from the devastation that the war caused. There were 90,000 soldiers that were killed, and more than 2 million people were taken away and held captive at concentration camps. With German forces occupying the majority of France, their national identity suffered as the revolutionary slogan, liberty, equality, fraternity, was replaced with a much more conservative slogan, work, family, and nation. So if you see the picture here, on the top left is Irene Nemirovsky, and she is the person I will be speaking of first. The Russian Jewish immigrant Irene Nemin, sorry, Nemirovsky, before she was sent to her death in the Auschwitz, was a prolific writer whose works, at one point, of course, could not be published because of her Jewish heritage. So, at one point, she was highly published, and then there was this particular period of time after Nazis occupied France that nobody would publish her works anymore. Uh, um, she wrote this novel called Prose, Sweet Prose, and this was uh, only two parts of the novel were finished before she was sent to Auschwitz and killed. In Sweet Prose, uh, she writes about the detailed records of France's defeat and the Nazi invasion. And even before the results of the war were declared, she has this almost kind of an uncanny foresight about how it would pan out for the French. So the, the second part of the novel talks about the relationship between the occupier and the occupied, the forbidden attraction that develops from the fact that these are the conquerors, but also this coerced sense of hospitality that they are bound to show them. So on the top right, right beside her, was a Holocaust survivor called Charlotte Delbo. She was a political prisoner and she survived Auschwitz and wrote about her experience in a novel called Auschwitz and After. Then at the bottom, there is of course uh, Jean-Paul Sartre's not here. Uh, Another writer was Jean-Paul Sartre. His picture is not here. He is responsible for seminal work in the field of existentialism, but he was also a very prominent writer of the French Resistance. His play The Fly retells the myth of Orestes and his sister Electra. Orestes rejects religious and political authority and revolts against the gods. He is an existentialist who recognizes his own autonomy and freedom during the course of the play. Albert Camus, whose picture is here, wrote his novel The Plague or La Peste in 1945, but the novel was published in 1947. The novel details the story of a fictional town called sorry Oran, where a disease had spread from rats and killed half the population, and it was about to kill half of all humanity. The novel is Camus' reflection on what plague means for humanity. And the novel presents us with a very interesting metaphor for that silent, invisible disease uh, that can infect people at any point. Our lives are absurd because it can end at any time and be rendered meaningless, and that makes the plague a metaphor for the absurdism of life. Pestilence is so common, but there are many plagues in the world that have as many plagues in the world as there have been wars. Yet plagues and wars always find people completely unprepared. Camus says, when war breaks out, people say, it won't last, it's too stupid. War is certainly too stupid, but that doesn't prevent it from lasting. It is a plague of this kind that Andrew McLaren writes about when he says, there is no more powerful weapon than the unseen echo that encircles the earth and passes from one point into the hearts of millions. The absurdity of life is, for Camus, not a reason to despair, but what gives life meaning. As Camus says, paraphrasing Descartes, I rebel and therefore we are. In India, Mulk Raj Anand was so basically not in India. Mulk Raj Anand was working for BBC London, and during the years of the war, he produced this novel, The Sword and the Sickle. It's a commentary on social political structures on communism, and has a very anti-communist stance. The title of the book was given to Anand by George Orwell, who had become his friend after working with him for a while, and just like Orwell in his 1984 An Animal Farm, he too presents the dangers of communism, which may lead to a totalitarian state. Now, in Germany, Gunter Grass, W.G. Sebald, and George Friedrich were prominent names when it came to World War II literature. Sebald wrote an essay in 1999, that's almost uh, 40 years or so after the war was over. It was titled Natural History of Destruction, which he later turned into a book in 2003. Here he highlights the German wartime experiences, loss of life, the bombing of German cities by the Allied forces. The essay gives rise to a host of angry responses and letters from readers who claim that the bombing was a deserved punishment for the German collective guilt. This collective guilt is the reason why Germans have often displayed remorse and guilt at the horrors perpetrated by the Germans, but the horrors perpetrated on them during the war, of which there were many, they are quite silent about those. The critical response to documentation of German suffering during the war is termed as self-pitying. And this is one of the reasons why literature dealing with their own experience comes very late in world literature. Gunter Grass writes this novel called Im Krebsgang. Im Krebsgang is basically a German for crab walk. So this is a reference to the way a crab scuttles backwards to move forward. So here too, he says that they must address their past so that they can move onward from their past. For German public too, it was necessary to trace their steps back to the violence of the war in order to finally move on from it. At the heart of the novel is the sinking of the German ship Wilhelm Gustloff, which was sunk by a torpedo from the Soviet submarine. Now, this ship carried civilians, injured soldiers, and refugees from German East. And it's considered one of the greatest maritime tragedies in all of history, with 9,300 lives lost at sea. The tragedy at the time of the air raids and the bombing had already brought Germany to its knees. So it was Germany was always in the last leg of war when this happened, and with mass migration, Germany had already had more than 2.5 million lost lives. The story highlights the cyclic nature of violence and how it creates a culture of abuse that outlives the initial acts of violence. George Frederick, is a German historian who has written strongly anti-Nazi and anti-war writing. He is, however, best known for his book called Der Brand, or The Fire, which is a docu-fiction about his experiences of war from the point of view of a German. It details airstrikes, bombing faced by German cities. Frederick reminds the readers that it is important to share a collective sense of responsibility for the evils of the Holocaust. And it is also essential to document the way the war was witnessed by them. With that, he outlines the lived experience of 80 million incendiary bombs that were dropped on German cities by Allied forces. The novel highlights uh, German experience, but it also talks about German guilt and the feeling of atonement towards the rest of the world. Written 6 decades after the end of the war, the book has garnered both support and criticism due to its controversial content. Heinrich Wohl uh, is a one of the uh, foremost post World War II writers. His writings on war were from the perspective of a reluctant German soldier who was made to take part in a war that he did not believe in. Uh, he won the Nobel Prize in 1972 for his body of work that included his work called Der Zug was pünktlich, which means the train was on time, and this is the train that was going to carry the soldiers from their homes to the battlefield. So many German Jews wrote survival stories if they made out of the Auschwitz alive. Notable works that came from Germany include Ruth Kluger, who wrote her autobiography, and it was called uh, Memory in Auschwitz, who wrote about her memory in Auschwitz as a young girl. It mingles the Holocaust survival story with the genre of the Bildungsroman. Um, Her writing examines how World War II, memory of the World War II, is inextricably commingled with memories of the Holocaust. The war, in other words, cannot be understood without the historical consciousness of the Holocaust and the reality of those who suffered through it. And with this, I will come to my very last slide, the Holocaust and trauma studies. One of the earliest writings on the topic of trauma and psychoanalytic point of view was done by Freud, who highlights in Beyond Pleasure principle how victims of trauma relive their past. We give the name trauma, Freud writes in Moses and Monotheism, to those impressions experienced early and later forgotten, to which we attach such importance in the etiology of neurosis. So Basically, this talks about how the experience cannot be processed by an individual when it is happening, but it is relived by the individual. It may happen that a man who has experienced some frightful accident, a railway collision, for instance, leaves the scene of the event apparently uninjured. He's not physically hurt. In the course of the next few weeks, he develops a number of physical and motor symptoms which can only be traced back to shock or whatever it was. And he now has traumatic neurosis. This was said by Freud. Peter Levy, the Holocaust survivor we just spoke about, says that the war is a terrible fact and is indeed something that is to be deprecated. However, it is an inherent part of human race, just like human proclivity towards hate and cruelty, and it is up to us to rationalize and understand it. Be that as it may, it is nearly impossible to understand an experience like the Auschwitz without having experienced it, and sometimes despite having experienced it. Another writer to the contemporary trauma theorists believe that it is this incomprehensibility which leads to trauma. One doesn't consciously experience trauma, only the after effects of something traumatic. Much of the Holocaust writing does not make an attempt to explain the horror, but underlines the limit of human understanding against the infinite capacity of human cruelty. Another writer to have written on the topic of trauma was Walter Benjamin, whose essay Some Motifs in Baudrillard tries to find a connection between trauma as Freud defines it and the images of the modern world. His essay on trauma, The Storyteller, illustrates that despite the fact that an exact articulation of war is impossible and beyond the reach of human understanding, certain shared images can convert history into collective memory. Um, I will move on to the conclusion. A generation had gone to school on horse-drawn carriages, streetcars, and now stood in the open sky in a countryside in which nothing remained unchanged but the clouds. Beneath these clouds, in the field force of destructive torrents and explosions, was the tiny, fragile human body. So this was said by Benjamin. And Kathy Carruth, the most influential critics of trauma theory, writes in her book, Trauma, Explorations in Memory. Trauma opens up challenges to a new kind of listening, witnessing precisely of impossibility. The traumatized, we may say, carry an impossible history within them, or they become themselves the symptom of a history that they cannot entirely process and thus which possesses them. Uh, in other words, the Holocaust and the bombs and the Blitz all are parts of history for those who witness it, but also uh, is a part of their psychological makeup and inextricably a part of the identity. Before I finish, I just want to uh, uh, bring your attention to the painting behind Blind Man in Balsen by Alan Moore. Now, Alan Moore was a part of the British unit that went around from concentration camp to concentration camp, liberating uh, the prisoners. And these photos, so they took photos because Alan Moore said that there is absolutely no way that people will believe what we see here. So they took photos. And this painting is about that exact feeling that you might as well be a blind man walking through this, because it is, even if you can see what is happening, it is impossible for you to articulate it. So, as stated earlier, war literature is not about moral platitudes. It is far more multifaceted documentation of human experiences, often too complex or too absurd or too harrowing for words. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Snigdha, for such a elaborate, descriptive, critical, and as well as informative presentation, which clearly showcases the amount of research that had been put in preparing this particular lecture. So, congratulations to you for such a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Our participants really enjoyed your presentation, and the testimony to the fact is the plethora of messages congratulating you and thanking you for your critical as well as lucid presentation. Now, if you permit, I will put across to you a few questions which has been put forward by the participants. The first question is a very interesting one. Why did the publishers publish war poetry? Uh, it was already a chaotic period where people were losing control of their immediate reality. Wouldn't it have been better if the literary output focused more on escapist themes to divert the public?
That's a very interesting question. And to some extent, I feel like I agree. However, there was a general outcry from the public asking for war poetry, asking for information about what was going on. So there was this essay saying, "Where are the war poets now?" And it was in response to this that a lot of these poets wrote this whole essay about how nothing has changed, it is the same as it was before. But there was a huge demand to know what was happening on the battlefield because it's not like we can live in vacuum, even though we would like to.
Thank you. The second question is, the war made the real absurd. Would you agree to this?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The idea that Camus puts forward is that how can human life have meaning if something like, for example, a virus or a pathogen or an accident or a human action can end life of so many so suddenly? And that made him think that the idea is absurd. The human life is absurd, and the absurdity of life was in full display for him in something as as uh, revealing of human condition as a war.
Since you are a very young researcher, this question, I think you would justify this question. And the question is, what are some of the aspects of World War II that can be taken up for research? Now, before you
I
speak, I will just want you to answer, if possible, in two phases. One phase is for MA dissertations, and
okay
second phase is for PhDs.
okay. Without having given it much thought, I would say for MA dissertation, a study of existentialism and absurdism is a very interesting topic. If you're looking at the ideas that were put forward by Sartre or Simone de Beauvoir at that time, a lot of their work was about the idea of existentialism. And if you're looking at a philosophical angle and comparing that with war literature of the time, that would make a very decent MA dissertation. And I think PhD dissertation is like it's basically a study of like a whole genre, and one area that I think I would personally have loved to explore if I could do a dissertation again would have been Holocaust literature, because the sheer lack of language to explain something like that is extremely challenging. So I think that would bring up very interesting challenges for a PhD scholar.
We take the last question of the day. What is the new style of art that emerged after World War II?
I think after World War II, modernism moved closer to postmodernism. That is all I think I can say. This absurdity, postmodernism, meaning fell apart, so to speak. And people started reveling in the idea that there was no meaning.
Anything special from the art perspective?
Not off the top of my head.
Anyways, uh, my co-organizer, the lady behind the brain behind this particular course, she couldn't join today because she has some urgency at home. Dr. Vasudhara Roy, she has conveyed her heartful regards and namaskar to you for agreeing to take this challenging topic and preparing a very decent and critical presentation. As one of the participants has rightly remarked, that very smooth and easy to understand session. Not for a single minute did I feel that this is getting difficult or is going beyond my understanding. Thank you so much for this wonderful and informative session. So this was the kind of feedback of your session,
Thank you so
which
much.
clearly testifies the kind of hard work and dedication and the time that you have spent on researching this topic once again and preparing such a lucid presentation and a critical one and a very informative one. So, on behalf of Team DAATH, Dr. Snigdha, it was an absolute honor and pleasure to have you today. And thank you so much for agreeing and
It's an
taking up
honor
this
to be
challenge.
here.
And
Honor to be here, sir.
we would love to have you in the near future as well in our future
I look
endeavors.
forward to it.
And on behalf of Team DAATH Voyage, my co-organizer Dr. Basudhara and myself, namaskar from Team DAATH Voyage. Until we meet soon, sooner, very sooner. And participants, please do take care. We meet tomorrow again at 6:30 for our lecture number 14. Thank you so much. Please do take care. Good night.